Who is Cregan Stark? The Stark behind Roddy the Ruin. Warning: this video contains major spoilers for House of the Dragon, including Cregan Stark, Jacaerys Velaryon, Roddy the Ruin, the Winter Wolves, and the ending of the Dance of the Dragons. If you want to experience these events fresh, this is your warning. When you hear the name Stark in Westeros, you probably think of Ned Stark, Jon Snow, or Robb Stark. But hundreds of years before them, another Stark became one of the most important figures in Targaryen history. His name was Cregan Stark. Known as the Wolf of the North, Cregan was Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North during the Dance of the Dragons. And although his role in House of the Dragon has been relatively small so far, his decisions helped shape one of the most important military campaigns of the entire war. Because Cregan is the man who sent Roddy the Ruin and the Winter Wolves south. And there is a very good reason he did it. Cregan Stark was born around 108 AC and became Lord of Winterfell while still very young after the death of his father, Rickon Stark. Because Cregan was a minor, his uncle Bernard initially ruled the north as regent. But when Cregan came of age, Bernard was reluctant to surrender power. Cregan eventually took control himself, imprisoning his uncle and his sons. That early part of Cregan's life tells us something important about him. He wasn't a passive ruler. He believed authority had to be defended, and he was willing to make difficult decisions to secure the future of House Stark. By the time the Dance of the Dragons began, Cregan was firmly in control of the north. Then Prince Jacaerys Velaryon arrived at Winterfell. Jace wasn't there simply to visit. He had an important mission. Rhaenyra needed allies. The Greens had crowned Aegon II, and the Targaryen succession had turned into a civil war. Jacaerys flew north to convince Cregan Stark to support his mother's claim, and Cregan agreed. The alliance became known as the Pact of Ice and Fire. In the book, the pact included a future marriage between Jacaerys' firstborn daughter and Cregan's son Rickon. Jace never lived long enough to have that daughter, but the political alliance remained extremely important. The television series simplifies the arrangement and doesn't reproduce every controversial detail from Fire and Blood. But the central idea remains the same. The North would support Rhaenyra. And that decision would eventually send thousands of northern soldiers into the dance. But Cregan faced a problem. The North is enormous. Moving an entire northern army south would take time. Winter was approaching, and Cregan couldn't simply empty Winterfell and leave the north defenseless. So he needed soldiers who could move immediately. That's where Roddy the Ruin came in. Lord Roderick Dustin, better known as Roddy the Ruin, became the leader of the Winter Wolves. The Winter Wolves were a group of northern warriors who marched south to fight for Rhaenyra. And their name tells you almost everything about their mission. Many were older men. They were experienced warriors who understood that the coming war could kill them. Instead of keeping every available soldier in the north, Cregan could send these older fighters south while younger men remained behind to protect their homes and help the north survive the coming winter. So Roddy wasn't simply an expendable soldier. He was the perfect commander for a very specific mission. He had experience, he was aggressive, and most importantly, he understood the mentality of the men following him. The Winter Wolves didn't march south expecting to return home. They went knowing that many of them would die, and that's why their role in the dance became so important. They arrived when Rhaenyra desperately needed military support. The Northerners fought alongside the Black forces and became involved in some of the most important battles of the war. Roddy's leadership helped turn the Winter Wolves into a terrifying battlefield force. And eventually, their reputation became legendary. This is where Cregan's character becomes more interesting. He wasn't simply sending soldiers to fight for a queen. He was honoring a political promise while also protecting the North's long-term survival. That is a very Stark-like calculation. Duty mattered, but so did survival. And Cregan understood that both had to be balanced. The book gives Cregan and Jace a much deeper relationship than the television series has shown. In Fire and Blood, they become close and even swear an oath of brotherhood. The book also contains the controversial account of Jace secretly marrying Cregan's bastard half-sister, Sarah Snow. However, the historical accounts in Fire and Blood conflict with each other, and the story is deliberately presented as unreliable history. The television series chose not to include that storyline. Instead, the show keeps the relationship between Cregan and Jace focused on politics, duty, and the alliance between their houses. But whether their relationship was deeply personal or primarily political, the result was the same. Cregan committed House Stark to Rhaenyra's cause, and Roddy became the man who carried that commitment onto the battlefield. The Winter Wolves then fought in several major engagements. They suffered terrible casualties, but helped the Blacks achieve important victories. By the time they reached Tumbleton, Roddy had become one of the most dangerous commanders on Rhaenyra's side. And that brings us to the most important thing about Cregan Stark. He wasn't a dragon rider, he didn't have an enormous fleet. He wasn't sitting on the Iron Throne. His power came from something much simpler: the North, and the loyalty of its people. Cregan understood that House Stark didn't need dragons to matter. A Stark army marching south was enough to change the balance of power, and the Winter Wolves were the first expression of that power. But Cregan's own role in the war was far from finished. Because while Roddy and his men were fighting, Cregan was still in the north preparing his own army, and eventually he would march south himself. By the time Cregan finally arrives in King's Landing, the dance of the dragons has changed completely. Rhaenyra is dead. Aegon II is also dead, and the Targaryen civil war has left the realm devastated. Cregan arrives with his northern army after the major fighting has already ended, but that doesn't mean his role is unimportant. In fact, this is where Cregan earns another famous title, the Old Man of the North. Cregan becomes Hand of the King to the young Aegon III and takes control of the capital during a period remembered as the Hour of the Wolf. And this is where Cregan's reputation for harsh justice becomes extremely important. He believes the people responsible for crimes during the war must answer for what they did. Cregan doesn't arrive simply to collect rewards for supporting the Blacks. He wants the political settlement of the war handled according to his understanding of honor and justice. His time as Hand is brief, but it becomes legendary. And that is one of the reasons Cregan Stark is so fascinating. He doesn't need to spend an entire season on screen to become important. His decisions echo through the story. He makes the pact with Jacaerys. He sends Roddy the Ruin and the Winter Wolves south. He keeps House Stark committed to the Black cause. And eventually, he arrives in King's Landing when the Targaryen dynasty is at its weakest. The show has only shown a fraction of this story so far. Cregan's television role has been much smaller than his importance in Fire and Blood, partly because the series chose to keep Jace's Winterfell storyline short. But Season 3 has now shown exactly why that Northern Alliance mattered. Roddy the Ruin's final battle at Tumbleton demonstrates the cost of Cregan's decision. Roddy fights for Rhaenyra, reaches Ormond Hightower, and kills him before both men are consumed by the chaos of the battle. The show's version differs from the book, but the basic historical event remains recognizable. The Winter Wolves came south because Cregan had promised support, and Roddy became the sword of that promise. So, who is Cregan Stark? He is the Stark who stood at the crossroads between the Targaryen dynasty and the North. He is a young lord who inherited Winterfell early and learned to rule through difficult decisions. He is the man Jacaerys needed to convince. He is the architect of the alliance that brought northern soldiers into the dance. And he is the lord who sent Roddy the Ruin and the Winter Wall south when Rhaenyra needed them most. But perhaps the most interesting thing about Cregan is what happens after the war. Unlike many of the major players in the dance, Cregan survives. He doesn't die fighting for the throne. He doesn't become consumed by dragons. He doesn't lose himself chasing power. He walks into the aftermath. And that makes him one of the few characters who gets to see what the war actually accomplished. Almost nothing. The Targaryens destroy themselves. The dragons destroy each other. Thousands of people die, and the Iron Throne remains. Cregan Stark understands the lesson. Power without stability is meaningless. And perhaps that's why the Starks continue to be remembered long after the dance. They don't need dragons. They have something else: duty, honor, and the willingness to act when they give their word. That is who Cregan Stark really is. Not just the Stark behind Roddy the Ruin. And if House of the Dragon continues to explore the aftermath of the war, Cregan Stark could become much more important than his limited screen time suggests.